In 1988, Japanese schoolgirl Junko Furuta was 17 years old. She had aspirations of being a pop star, but these dreams would never be fulfilled, and she would never see her 18th birthday because she was kidnapped, tortured for 40 days, murdered, and then discarded like rubbish. There were multiple men involved, but these are the 4 that were eventually convicted. The depravity in this case, and the lenient sentences they received, will sicken you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Junko Furuta was born on the 18th of January 1971 in Misato, a city approximately 15 miles northeast of Tokyo on the island of Honshu, Japan. She was a daughter and a sister to 2 brothers. She attended high school where she had excellent grades and near perfect attendance. In 1988, to support her family, she was working a part-time job after school at a plastic moulding factory. She was loved by many and had her whole life ahead of her. In contrast, the men who ended her life had no aspirations of doing anything that wouldn't benefit themselves. This is Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader of this group, with the picture on the left being taken around the time of this offence when he was aged 16 years old, and the photo on the right from when he fell foul of the law again in 2013. Miyano was already a hardened criminal by the age of 16, having aligned himself with Yakuza gangsters and in a history of escalating offending behaviour, beginning with shoplifting, progressing to criminal damage, and eventually sexual offending. He was a bully at school and frequently bragged about his Yakuza connections, and it appears that his only aspiration was to become a gangster, taking what he wanted and victimising anyone he wanted, including innocent schoolgirls. This is his associate, Shinji Minato, aged 18 at the time of this offence. I can't find much information about him, outside of a reference to his parents having concerns about his propensity for violence and his organised crime connections. The last 2 offenders, Joe Agura and Yasushi Watanabe, were both aged 17 at the time. I also can't find much information about them, but I think it's safe to say that all 4 individuals shared similar attitudes and beliefs, and especially related to targeting and victimising women for sexual purposes. At around 8:30 p.m. on the 25th of November 1988, Miyano and Minato were apparently wandering around Misato with the intention of raping a woman when they spotted Junko riding her bike home from work. Minato, under Miyano's orders, knocked Junko off her bike and fled the scene. Miyano, pretending to be a concerned citizen, went and helped Junko, offering to walk her home. He then took her to a warehouse and raped her, then took her to a hotel and raped her again, all the while telling her he would kill her if she resisted. As if this violation wasn't bad enough, Junko's nightmare was only just beginning. Miyano then called the other 3 offenders and bragged about raping Junko, before apparently Agura came up with the idea of holding her captive so numerous other men could do the same to her. Junko was then taken to a park by Miyano where the other 3 boys were waiting, and having found her address from a notebook in her bag, threatened that if she tried to escape, she would be killed by the Yakuza. Junko was then taken to a house owned by Minato's parents, and it was here that her real ordeal began. It's important for later to point out that Minato's parents were living at the address at the time, so they must have heard the absolute horror that Junko endured in this house, which is truly sickening and almost beyond belief. On the 28th of November 1988, Miyano invited 2 boys to the property, and they all began to abuse Junko. Her screams woke up Minato's parents, but they were told nothing was the matter. The boys then took turns raping Junko. The group held Junko captive in the Minato residence for 40 days, where they tortured and abused her day and night for this entire time. As well as taking turns raping Junko, they encouraged others to do the same, and invited their friends and Yakuza members round to the property for this purpose. As I said at the beginning of the video, 4 people were eventually convicted for their participation in this horror, but it's believed that as many as 100 men and boys came to the property to violate Junko, and she was likely raped approximately 400 times over the course of her ordeal. However, this was only part of the nightmares she endured. Statements from the 4 boys indicate that she was mercilessly beaten and degraded, and this included being beaten with fists, kicked, as well as having dumbbells dropped on her stomach. Her head was also bashed against the cement floor or beaten with golf clubs. Junko's genitals were also burnt with cigarettes and lighters, and her eyelids were burned with hot wax. She would also have objects forced into her vagina and anus, including lit matches, bottles, and metal rods. The boys tore off Junko's nipples with a pair of pliers and inserted sewing needles into her breasts. She was also forced to drink her own urine. However, Junko still fought for her life and tried to find a way to escape. Around day 20, whilst the group were resting, Junko tried to call the police but was caught. As a punishment, her feet were drenched in lighter fluid and set on fire, meaning that she was unable to walk for the last 20 days of her life. Due to her injuries, Junko lost control of her bowels, and as her wounds became infected, they would seep pus. She begged to be killed, but the boys would not grant her any peace. When the boys lost sexual interest in Junko, they kidnapped and raped a 19-year-old woman who was on her way home from work. This was while Junko was still being held captive in the Minato residence. According to my research, late on the 3rd of January 1989, Miyano lost a game of mahjong and was apparently fuming. So on the 4th of January 1989, he decided to take his anger out on Junko. He did this by pouring lighter fluid on her body and setting her on fire. She tried to put out the flames, but in her weakened state was essentially at the mercy of these boys. She was then subjected to a sustained attack by the boys, lasting several hours, where she was beaten repeatedly, and eventually her body gave out, and Junko died. The boys, clearly trying to save their own skin, decided to dispose of her body and put it in a 5-gallon drum filled with wet cement, and this was then dumped. The boys were arrested later that month, not for the murder of Junko, but for the abduction and abuse of the 19-year-old girl they took while she was being held captive. During interrogation, Ogura told the police about Miyano committing a murder. Miyano immediately confessed to torturing and murdering Junko. Police then recovered the drum containing Junko's body, pictured above, broke it open, and recovered her remains. If the nature of the crime upsets you, then unfortunately the court proceedings will make your blood boil. So none of the boys were convicted of murder, and instead pleaded guilty to, quote, committing bodily injury that resulted in death. So not rape, or torture, or any of the specific degrading acts they forced upon Junko. Due to their youth, they were given special treatment, and this was reflected in their sentences. Hiroshi Miyano was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Joe Ogura was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Shinji Minato was sentenced to between 5 to 9 years in prison. Yasushi Watanabe was sentenced to 5 to 7 years in prison. So these boys would be released at the earliest when they were in their 20s and at the latest in their 30s, free to live more than half their life when they robbed Junko of any chance of doing the same. They didn't just kill her, but they killed everything she could have been, all the memories she would have made, and the people whose lives she would have touched and influenced. They robbed her of having children, grandchildren, and living the life she deserved. As a further sickening twist, Minato's family members, the ones who were living in the property where Junko was held, did not face any charges after convincing the court they did not know what was going on. I'm absolutely speechless. This poor girl was held in their property for over a month, and they did not apparently hear her screams, or smell her burnt flesh, or notice the stream of men attending day and night to abuse her. I have no words. I'm angry just talking about this case, and I cannot imagine the pain Junko's parents must have felt from losing their daughter and then being robbed of, in my opinion, justice. So, what happened to the 4 boys? Did they ever show any remorse? The answer appears to be no. In fact, it seems that some of them appear to take great pride in what they did. With regard to Hiroshi Miyano, he was released in 2009 and apparently went back to his organised crime connections and became a wealthy man due to his involvement in various scams, with him driving around in a BMW, wearing luxury watches and designer clothes. He's described as talking about his love of sex and his enjoyment at tying women up for this purpose. He was rearrested in 2013 for fraud charges, but later these were dropped. His current location is unknown. Released in 1999, Shinji Minato apparently tried to become a professional fighter, but was unable to because the crowd recognised him and booed him at his bouts. He apparently got married sometime in the early 2000s and had a daughter. However, in 2018, then aged 45 years old, Minato was arrested again for attempted murder after beating a 32-year-old man with a metal rod, stabbing him and slashing his throat with a knife. He is cited as stating, quote, "I certainly stabbed and beat him, but I did not intend to kill him." It looks like this came to court, but I cannot find an outcome. I can find some reference to Minato's incoherent ramblings during at least one hearing, calling the attack a fabrication. He's also apparently a fan of conspiracy theories. Originally released in 1999, Joe Agura was sent back to prison for 7 years in 2004 for beating a man. This man was someone that Agura apparently believed was involved with his girlfriend, so he tracked him down, kidnapped him, and then beat him for 4 hours, during which time he threatened the man, telling him that he killed before and knew how to get away with it. As an aside, and just to show the wonderful family it produced this creature, Agura's mother is alleged to have vandalised Junko's grave due to the fact that she had ruined her son's life. Let that sink in. The blame for her monster of a son and his decisions to be involved in the torture and murder of another human being was the innocent victim. Agura was subsequently released and appears to be living life as a free man at the time of this recording. Yasushi Watanabe is the only one of the 4 who appears to have not reoffended yet, since his release from prison in 1999. However, in terms of remorse, I found reference to him bragging about his role in the murder of Junko. Usually, I talk about the psychology of the individual offenders. However, I've covered the issue of group offences in at least one other video, and I will not mention their names again. But I do want your thoughts on this horrific case. In particular, do you think it's right that children get leniency in court for this type of offence? At what point are children fully responsible for their actions? However, I want to close this video by talking about the person who mattered, Junko Furuta, the 17-year-old girl whose life came to such a horrific end, who endured 40 days of torture, which is 960 hours. I want you to remember her name and her face so that she is not forgotten, because she endured unimaginable horror in her final days, and yet she kept on trying to fight and escape and live. I hope that she is at peace now.